Hello and welcome to Asia in Depth. I'm Michelle Florcruz. Have you ever walked through a museum and wondered where the artwork and artifacts on display come from? Curators usually source artwork from museums, auction houses, and dealers, but often what you see are pieces loaned by individuals from their personal collections. Today, we're speaking to one of the most prominent individual collectors of Asian art, John C. Weber. For Weber, his fondness for collecting started at an early age with baseball cards. But when he was a pre-med student at Colgate University, he enrolled in some art history classes and he often visited a small museum on campus. Weber was hooked. He got his first taste of art collecting as a young man when he bought more than a dozen Rembrandt etchings. He eventually turned his focus to traditional Asian art. Weber had a pivotal role in building the impressive collection of ancient Chinese art at New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art. In the late 90s, his eye turned to Japanese art, and he began to amass what is today considered by many to be one of the finest collections outside of Japan. Many of Weber's pieces are at the center of the new Asia Society Museum exhibition, The Art of Impermanence, on view now through April 26 at Asia Society, New York. The exhibition features more than 60 masterpieces of calligraphy, painting, sculpture, and textiles drawn from Weber's personal collection and Asia Society's Mr. and Mrs. John D. Rockefeller third collection. In this episode, Adriana Proser, the John H. Foster Senior Curator for Traditional Asian Art at Asia Society Museum, sits down with Weber to discuss his life as a collector and the people and experiences that shaped his prolific collection.
John, one of the fascinating things about John D. Rockefeller III as a collector is kind of looking back at his upbringing and the fact that both of his parents were collectors and that he grew up with objects all around him well before he himself became a collector. I was wondering about your past and the way you grew up and how that may or may not relate to the collector that you've become.
I think collecting is sort of instinctual to some degree. You sort of start out with, in my case, baseball cards. And then when I was a young adult, I started to buy some Rembrandt etchings. At that point, they were reasonably priced, so a young man could buy them because there were multiple copies and produced by Rembrandt in his lifetime. So my parents were not collectors, and we had a well-decorated home, but I don't think they thought of them as collecting. There's a big difference between decorating and collecting. A decorator buys things because it has a place, it's the right color, it's the right shape, and so forth. And a collector instinctively buys things and puts it in the closet.
So when you were growing up, then were your parents museum goers? Or you were mainly going to baseball games, or did you enjoy cultural outings as well, or was that something that developed as you matured?
I grew up in Cold Spring Harbor in Huntington area on Long Island, and that was we didn't come into the city very often. There was a local Heckscher Historical Museum, but that was not an art museum. I don't think it was until I went to college that I got really sort of plugged into, what an exhibition was. And I was at Colgate University, and that they have an art museum, and it's nice enough, but it's not on the standard of, Harvard, Yale, Princeton.
Did you take any art history classes when you were an undergraduate?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I almost got myself into trouble because of it. I was a pre-med student, which means chemistry, physics, biology courses. But in addition to that, whatever electives I had were very much on the humanities side, and I took a lot of art history courses. And when I was applying to graduate school, one of the people interviewing me said, "I see you're taking a lot of art history. We don't have students like that here." And then I just said very simply, I guess self-confident, said, "Well, then this is not the place for me, and so will you excuse me?"
Tell me a little bit about, as you started to collect, when you started to collect those Rembrandt's sketches, when you started to collect art, did you have somebody in mind as a role model? Did you have a sense of how you should go about doing that? Or was that also something that developed as you started to collect more and more?
I think the Rembrandt etchings, which I have maybe 20 of, are. I asked the advice of a dealer, and that was all. But when I started to collect Japanese art, my role model was Mary Burke, okay, who was a good friend, lived in the same building that I do. We got together often for lunch and would sort of show off what we had. And of course, her collection was much more extensive. I wish I had met her earlier in my life, because towards the later years, she wasn't as active.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she was really one of the. She was a great American collector of Japanese art, and really lived with her art all around her, and also was very generous in terms of lending work and encouraging students. And I've noticed that these are also things that interest you with your collection. Why don't you talk a little bit more about that? Because it also interests me, thinking about the Rockefellers, because they when they decided they were going to collect Asian art, they really honed in on the fact that they wanted to collect in a particular sort of way and really build a collection of extremely strong material that was going to be representative of a whole range of different Asian cultures. And they were thinking of it not just as a collection for themselves, but also as a collection that they wanted to share with other Americans, to help educate other Americans about Asia and the strength of Asian culture and the breadth of and ancientness of Asian culture. What has your thinking been around your collection? Are these issues that you've been thinking about as you build the collection?
The first group of things that I bought were ancient Chinese things, and that was that collection has been given to the Metropolitan Museum, and that's there at the Weber Galleries of Ancient Chinese things. I had a day job at New York Hospital and Cornell Medical School. I think that anybody who wants to be serious about the collection has to be well advised by somebody who's really a professional, but also somebody who allows the collector to have their head without having them too closely on a bit, okay? And I see that the same thing really was the way the Rockefellers and Sherman Lee worked. Okay, I've read a book that was about Sherman and his relationship with the Rockefellers. Collecting is not just buying a few things for decoration. It really, to some degree, should have some focus. And when I was doing the ancient Chinese galleries at the Met, James Watt was the person who advised us. When it became apparent that it was going to be a historic opportunity to collect Japanese art because of the economic situation in Japan, that I needed to be advised, and that's where Julia Meach came in. And has been a wonderful consultant and advisor and friend. I don't know the details of the relationship that Sherman and the Rockefellers had, but I noticed that the Rockefellers were buying Asian art before they brought Sherman on board, and I think Sherman was still in Cleveland. Mm-hmm. And so there was always a little bit of, does Cleveland get this or does the Rockefellers get this? But they worked that out. And maybe it was as simple as flipping a coin.
Right.
But
right. So that actually, so Sherman Lee, in fact, the Rockefellers were seriously collecting for about a decade before they decided they really needed an expert advisor who was really kind of dedicated to working with them, and that's when they brought on Sherman Lee to work with them, and then a very intense period of collecting followed and of honing their collection, and actually the story and it is fact that they had an agreement, Sherman Lee and John D. Rockefeller III, that if the two of them saw a piece of art that they both wanted at the same time, then they would flip a coin to see who would get that piece of art. Mm-hmm. Other than that, it was first come, first serve. That was the deal. That was the way that they worked. But as you say, I really think that the personalities of the collector, or the collectors, I should say, come through in their group of objects. They talk about very much about wanting to choose pieces of art that stirred and lifted them. That there was some kind of an emotional connection with, as well as an aesthetic connection with.
Yeah, I think I was advised by the director of the Tokyo National Museum, who Julia Meach had known for many years. And I asked him when I first started if he had any advice for a new collector. I didn't say a young collector because I was already fairly mature. And he said, yes, don't buy anything that you could walk past without stopping, okay? So I think that's always the first thing, is what kind of visual and to some degree emotional response do you have to something. Now, that's not sufficient. What you want to know beyond that, because if that doesn't happen, the process doesn't even start. But beyond that, you want to know a lot about the context of that object, okay? Where was it produced? When was it produced? Who was it produced for? And that varies over time. Especially in my knowledge of Japanese art, the little knowledge I have is that the patrons changed over time. Okay, the earlier Jomon were basically hunter-gatherers, and they were just wandering around. They were producing things that they could use. But as you go on, and then Buddhism came and the written language came to Japan, you started to have the church was the major purchase, and eventually the aristocracy was the people who were paying for the art to be produced, and eventually the merchant class. And so it's, if you're going to talk about impermanence, one of the things is that's impermanent is who's commissioning artwork, okay? And that makes a big difference in terms of what gets produced and even the style that things are produced, because certainly the merchants were buying things that were sort of had a stronger decorative part. Certainly by the Edo period, I think of Japanese art as having a larger decorative element, and I think that's one reason why it appeals to Westerners, because of the decorative quality of that. And some of my early pieces, I think, have a sort of a visual impact, but they're not. I think most people wouldn't think of them as being decorative, but they're. I think of them as being fascinating.
We're taking a short break to tell you about the Asia Society Triennial, which opens on June 5th in New York City. More than 40 artists and collectives from 19 countries have been selected to participate in the first citywide festival celebrating contemporary art from Asia. Working across a variety of disciplines and representing countries from across Asia and the Asian diaspora, this dynamic group of artists brings together a diverse range of works and viewpoints. The featured exhibition, titled We Do Not Dream Alone, will be on view at Asia Society Museum and multiple locations throughout New York City. Check out the full list of artists and venue partners coming together at asiasociety.org/triennial. Now, back to John Weber and Adriana Prozer.
Do you have a sense of what it is that stops you in your tracks?
Oh, that's that's almost impossible to define. I think it's somehow it speaks to you, and you get the message from it.
So what has most recently stopped you in your tracks?
Julia Meach, Dr. Meach, I call it different things at different times. We go to Japan once a year, and we visit dealers, and we visit exhibitions. And if we go to an exhibition and we see something that really interests us, and it says private collection is a euphemism for it's owned by a dealer. And then you track that down. And so the thing that really stopped us in our tracks was the recent sculpture that we bought, and that's in this exhibition, because it was in the middle of a room at sort of so you could see it from a distance, and it was just, we just didn't go any further.
So this is a very powerful looking deity, wrathful deity, Fudo Myo.
Yeah.
And he's standing on waves.
Yeah. It is, and there's a whole story that's probably made up about how that subject came about, and it's what the waves, why he's on waves, and it was a story about a Japanese scholar coming from China, and they got caught in a storm, and so they prayed to the sculpture, and the waves were cut, mm-hmm. and they were saved. Mm-hmm. So that's where it comes from. But every time I certainly if I buy something, the real fun, one of the great fun things is is that research. And now with, you can Google and get almost anything you want. And plus, you have access to expertise. Julia Meach is very good about that because, first of all, she's extremely knowledgeable, but whatever she doesn't know, she's intellectually honest, but she knows who does know. Mm-hmm. She knows where to turn for whatever information that you want. So I get, sort of like a schoolboy, I get reading assignments, and that's a big part of it. And the other part of it is not only sort of having things in the boxes, but it's sharing them with other people and seeing what kind of reaction it elicits from people. And that could be exhibitions. It can be visitors. We get visitors often. When Mary Burke was living in my building, she had visitors often. And in those days, I got relatively few. Now that she's passed on, people who go to the Met come and visit me because geographically I live essentially across the street.
So you're talking about scholars and students and other museum professionals.
But I say now I'm the new Mary Burke, okay, because I get the visitors that she would have gotten because her collection is dispersed to Minneapolis and the Metropolitan Museum. So,
I've noticed that you, in particular, I think I've noticed that you're very curious about the technology involved in the production of the pieces that you own and that you lend and display, and often you ask for the assistance of conservators to study the materials that the artists have used to create those objects. I don't know. I mean, I would assume that perhaps because of your background in medicine and because you're trained in some of the sciences, that may be part of what sparks your interest, do you think?
I come from a science background with sort of, art history as a sort of corollary in my education. I've been fortunate to develop a very good relationship with Marco Leone, who's the chairman of the scientific analysis. And so I enjoy bringing things over. Can be as simple as, is this transparent reliquary? Is it glass or is it rock crystal? Mm-hmm. Okay, they can answer that question in 2 minutes. Okay, because they have the instrumentation to do that, and quite frankly, they enjoy doing that also, and so that their department has become very good friends. I'm on their visiting committee, and but because I sort of bridge the science side and the art side, I think I'm also helpful to them with the rest of their visiting committee because I can sort of help to translate that. But they're Marco's an extremely good communicator.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Tell me a little bit about Asia and your background in relation to Asia. Has that all been through the art, or is that something that you've also developed alongside of the art?
I was fortunate that when I was at Columbia, for a year and a half, I lived in a place called International House. As it would turn out, these International House was sponsored and formed by the Rockefellers. And there are three of them. There's one in New York, which is where I stayed, and there's one at Berkeley, and there's one in International House in Tokyo, where I just stay when I go to Tokyo. And so there's kind of a nice little linkage there. Yeah. But when I was in an International House, one of the people that I became very friendly with was an American student who was getting a PhD in Chinese literature. And so, as people do, they talk about what they're interested in, and at dinner and weekends and so forth. And so I think that was sort of the initial, but that was a time when collecting was impossible during the Korean War because there was an embargo on Chinese material. And so my first interest really was in Asia was China. And as it turned out that the Met really had a big influence on that, because they wanted somebody to redo their ancient Chinese galleries and sort of fill out their Chinese collection. And that happened because Mr. Sackler had left to go to Washington, and that's now the Free Sackler. But they had thought that his collection would come to the museum. So, and that was a great experience. And I think, but that was specifically not a private collection or a personal collection. It was right from the beginning, it was a museum collection.
Right. Tell me a little bit, because you have served a number of places on committees and on boards. You've also have been involved with Asia Society in one way or another for quite a long time. And tell me a little bit about Asia Society, your relationship with Asia Society, and the role that it has played in your life as a New Yorker.
I think it became known that in New York that I had an interest in Asia, and Andy Pekarik, who had been an advisor, worked for Mary Burke, and then came to the Asia Society for be a curator for the collection here. And so he said, would you be interested in getting more involved? And I said, well, what does that mean? And he said, well, would you like to go on the board of? And I said, okay. And it comes with certain commitments. And so I was on the board for a number of years. And then when I started working on the collection for the Met, I had to focus on that. So I rotated off the board. But then I was asked to come on to the Asia Society's Gallery Advisory Committee. And that's really something I look forward to every year. And because I always learn something, and there's the other people there have become friends, and that's a good experience. And I've been focused on the Asia Society. And then when Adriana asked me if I would be interested in doing impermanence, as it turned out, that I said, yeah, that sounds like it'd be really good. So it's really the first exhibition I've had in New York, which is mostly my material, and also the Rockefeller collection. And It's really special. I mean, having an exhibition in Berlin or Boston or Minneapolis or San Francisco and the Miho in Japan, that's great. But most of your friends and neighbors and family don't necessarily get the same sense of participation as if it's in your hometown.
Well, John, it's been just a great experience working on The Art of Impermanence with you, working on the beautiful catalog we've produced together for it, and I really appreciate your taking the time to talk with me today.
Well, I enjoy the opportunity, and it does mean that people will have, all over the world, will have access to my words of wisdom.
Thank you for listening to Asia in Depth. You can listen to other episodes of the Asia in Depth podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, and YouTube. Check out our show page at asiasociety.org/podcast and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at Asia Society. I'm Michelle Florcruz. See you next time.